and welcome to episode 23. Today I'll be discussing a really cool topic called phylogenetics, or the organization of species into their evolutionary lineages and families. This whole series I've been discussing evolution, mostly the ways that evolution works and how species adapt and react to selective pressures. In this episode, I'm going to take a step back so that we can appreciate evolution on a larger scale. I want you to see how evolution creates families of related organisms, and how by tracing these family lineages back through time, we can deduce the entire evolutionary pathway through which we developed, from the first single-celled organisms to multicellular life, to mammals, to primates, to Homo sapiens who drive cars and listen to science podcasts. I'll get into the story of human evolution on the next episode, but for today I'll be talking about phylogenetics in general. Speaking of generalities, the most general, all-encompassing phylogenetic tree in existence is the tree of life. This is the entire lineage of all life on Earth, starting with the first cells in the primordial soup, diverging into the bacteria, the archaea, and the eukaryotes, with each of these diverging into their own, kingdoms and phylums, classes and orders, families, genuses, and at the very tips of the tree of life, it represents individual species. The Tree of Life is both scientifically and artistically elegant. It depicts a summary of the evolutionary relationships between all living things, and many extinct things, and it does so in a way that's parsimonious and very Zen-like. It's a very simple depiction of the path life has taken. That first clump of self-replicating carbon evolved over 3.4 billion years into countless unique forms. Life is literally like a self-perpetuating tide of carbon, which spreads out in radiation events and undergoes genetic divergence and eventual speciation. And for each species, this happens again and again and again, until the world is covered in the trillions of descendants of millions of biochemical lineages that all originated from that one first cell. Okay, I'm being poetic. Let's get to the point. Phylogenetic trees, or family trees, are best represented visually, which is going to make this episode a little tricky, as I'm 100% audio. I'll do my best to describe how phylogenetic trees work, but it might be a little confusing if you don't have an image in front of you. If it's at all possible, while you listen to this episode, maybe look up an image of a phylogenetic tree on a search engine. If my descriptions are confusing or weird, seeing the actual images of the phylogenetic trees might help clear things up. When drawing a phylogenetic tree, start with a horizontal line with a node on the right tip. This first line is called the root, and it represents the most ancestral species in the lineage. It's the common ancestor of all the other species depicted in the phylogeny. The node is the point where a divergence and speciation event happened, and the ancestral population then split into two daughter species. This speciation event is represented by two lines that leave the node vertically and then turn to the right to be horizontal again. So far we have a common ancestor and two descendant species, and the phylogenetic tree looks like a two-pronged fork, or like a sideways football goalpost. Each branch also ends in a node, which represents more speciation events that take place millions of years down the road. Two new lineages branch out from each node just like they did before, and now the phylogenetic tree shows a common ancestor, its descendant species, and the species that descended from them. This is just a really basic phylogenetic tree, where the tips represent currently living or currently extant species, and the species closer to the root are older and older ancestor species in this family lineage. Phylogenies can be constructed by looking at the genetic similarities between species. As genes code for traits, closely related species will most likely have similar traits, while species who are distantly related will likely have very different traits. When species are closely related, they're relatively genetically similar. They share many of the same alleles from their common ancestor. Using the genetic information of the ancestor as a base to work off of, evolution creates derived traits, or new alleles derived from mutations in the alleles of the common ancestor species. Okay, so picture this. We have a hypothetical common ancestor of some kind of reptile, whose lineage has diverged 3 times, and so 2 cubed is 8, so this has produced 8 cousin species, all of whom are currently alive and living in the jungle. Let's say that during the first divergence, when the common ancestor reptile species first split into 2 daughter species, one of these evolved scales that were an intense red color, while the other remained a mottled brown. As these sibling lineages would go on to have their own divergences, the red scaly color remained in all of their offspring. So 4 of our 8 currently living species have red scales. This trait, the red scales, is called a synapomorphy. It's a trait that's shared between a bunch of related species and their common ancestor, but that's not shared by cousin species who are more distantly related. A synapomorphy is like a special trait that your family has, that none of your cousins' families have. This is also called a homology, or a trait that's similar in 2 related species because they share an ancestry where that trait emerged. By taking into consideration all of the many dozens of synapomorphies that link all living things together, scientists can recreate phylogenies and create clades or monophyletic groups. A monophyletic group is a common ancestor in every single one of its descendants. The name should give this away. Mono means one, and phylum is a Greek word meaning race or tribe. So monophyletic groups are evolutionary units of a single race or a single family. Like an elder ancestor and all of his children and grandchildren, the monophyletic group is a single ancestral species, and all the species that have descended from it. Synapomorphies can exist within a monophyletic group, representing traits that emerged somewhere in the clade and got passed on to subsequent generations of descendant species. If we were to be discussing an ancestral population and only some of its descendant species, but not all of them, then we're working with units called paraphyletic groups. Consider the monophyletic group mammals, which all emerged from a single ancestor species that existed hundreds of millions of years ago. This is a monophyletic group because we have the common ancestor and all the descendant species, which in this case are all mammals. But what if the criteria is limited to land-dwelling mammals? This is a paraphyletic group, because while the common ancestor of all mammals is still being taken into consideration, the criteria no longer includes aquatic mammals. This ground-dwelling paraphyletic group includes mammals like apes, giraffes, elephants, lions, dogs, bears, and people, but it doesn't include mammals like dolphins and whales. If we're just looking at land-dwelling mammals, if that's our in-group, then dolphins and whales have become the out-group. Dolphins and whales have a common ancestor with mammals, who have a common ancestor with reptiles, who have a common ancestor with amphibians. This common ancestor of the reptiles and amphibians and the mammals was most likely some kind of lobe-finned fish, like a lungfish that could tolerate the muddy, windy world above the oceans. The tetrapod ancestor, this lobe-finned fish, it used its lobes like rudimentary feet, and as they adapted to life on dry land, their fins, like the bones in their fins, turned into the bones of feet and hands. Paws, I guess. In the case of dolphins and whales, their evolutionary path would take them back into the water, and so they existed for a time as semi-aquatic mammals before diverging with hippopotamuses and going fully back into the ocean. The hippo populations remained on land, but their dolphin and whale cousins moved back into the sea. Their feet once again became flippers, reminiscent of the fins of their tetrapod ancestors. The flippers on a whale or a dolphin are really similar to the flippers on marine animals like sharks and larger fish. Recall that a homology is a trait shared through ancestry. The whales and dolphins have a trait in their fins, which help them swim through the water. And fish also have this trait. They also have fins and they also live in the water. And fins are good for getting through the water. But these similar traits are not homologies, because they didn't arise from a shared ancestry. The whale's ancestry lost their fins, they evolved feet, and then they evolved fins again as they returned to the ocean, while the fish kept their fins the whole time. This isn't a homology, this is a case of homoplasy, or convergent evolution. Homoplasy occurs when similar traits arise in unrelated or distantly related species, not because of shared genetics, but because of the shared environmental pressures that select for the similar trait, like the fin and the flipper, which both do the same function in the same environment. Genes and alleles can also be used to reveal whether traits are examples of homology or homoplasy. Some of my textbooks provide a common example, using a set of genes called Hox genes, H-O-X. Hox genes are shared between insects and humans, but are these a product of homology or homoplasy? To find out, scientists took a look at several important aspects of the Hox genes. First, the Hox genes in insects and humans share a regulatory sequence that is exactly the same, down to the nucleotide base. It's unlikely that this precision would come about through convergent evolution, which is rather sloppy when it comes to genetics. Second, the Hox genes are arranged in similar orders and positioned in the same places on the chromosome in both insects and humans. This is another layer of similarity that further discounts the idea of it being a homoplasy. Third, the Hox genes do the same function in both insects and humans, being expressed at the same time during development. Fourth, if insects and humans share the Hox genes to such a degree, then it follows that every other species in between insects and us also has these Hox genes. It stands to reason that in all of these intermediate species, the Hox genes are in the same place on the chromosome too, and they do the same job and get expressed at the same time. If it's the same in the insects and it's the same in us, then it follows that it should be the same in everything in between. When scientists looked at the data, they found that every species between us and insects did have these Hox genes. The crustaceans, the worms, the snails and squid, the starfish, and all vertebrates like cows and dogs and people, we all have the same Hox genes, in the same sequence for the same function. These Hox genes are the products of homology, as they were present in our common ancestor with insects, which existed more than 600 million years ago. And the Hox genes are still present in us today, and every species that diverged between us and the insects. So far, everything I've talked about has largely involved the study of genes, and the construction of mono- or paraphyletic groups based on the complex genetic relationships between families of living things. But how do biologists construct phylogenies of extinct creatures, of fossils, things that don't have any DNA we can extract and study? If we can't get DNA from a fossil, then how do we organize the species who left these fossils behind into coherent lineages? Fossils have their own qualities that can be used to help sort and organize them. For example, the shape of a fossil can tell us where in the body it was, and how it interacted with other bones to influence things like gait, posture, and biomechanics. Entire fossilized skeletons give us a remarkably sharp insight into what the extinct animal looked like. Groups of fossils, all in the same geologic strata, tell us which animals lived and interacted together, and which lived in entirely different epochs. Fossils can form in a number of ways. In almost all cases, some sort of anoxic mass has to cover the corpse, like mud or sand, or a dense cloud of volcanic ash or something. Once buried in a low-oxygen environment, the microbes responsible for decomposition can't breathe, and the corpse doesn't really decay. This can actually directly preserve the tissue, simply by stalling the decomposition process. If the organic tissue gets buried and then quickly decays, it's possible for minerals dissolved in rainwater to fill the gap. Much like molten metal is injected into a mold to produce a cast, the mineral-rich water fills the hole left behind by the decayed matter and solidifies into a stone, the same shape as the organic tissue. If the organic tissue gets buried, but the decay process takes a really long time, it's possible for these dissolved minerals to slowly fill in the spaces of the decaying tissue, cell by cell. As the decay progresses, the minerals slowly form a more complete cast of the organic tissue. When it's fully decayed, the end result is like a mineralized fossil, like a Theseus's ship, where every organic cell was replaced with a mineral copy. Many fossils like petrified wood and the blackened skeletons of the dinosaurs you would see at the Natural History Museum are examples of these kinds of slow decay mineralized fossils. Because of the extreme specificity in the conditions required for a fossil to form, fossils are actually pretty rare. Consider that for any given species, there could be millions or billions, if not trillions of individuals who are born and die over the course of a few million years. Of all these individuals, only a small handful are going to die in places where their corpse could be fossilized. But for most of these, the conditions aren't right, and they'll just rot away or be eaten by other animals. Only a small minority of these will ever actually become fossilized. And of those rare fossils that actually form, only a limited number will survive until the modern day. Many might be destroyed by geologic processes or by the clawing and stampeding of other animals. And of those fossils that form and persist through time, only a small number of them have been found. Consider an extinct species like the Archaeopteryx. Only 10 fossilized skeletons have ever been found, but when you calculate their lifespan versus their probable population size versus the length of time they existed as a species, you end up with a conservative estimate of around 2 billion individual Archaeopteryx that ever existed. Of these 2 billion, there are only 10, or 1 out of every 200 million who happen to get fossilized and discovered. This is important to understand when using the fossil record to reconstruct phylogenies. The fossil record is biased. It's not a complete picture of the past, by any stretch of the imagination. First of all, fossils are most likely to form in areas where sediment could quickly bury a body, places like beaches, bogs, and swamps. Organisms that don't live near these areas are much less likely to ever get fossilized in the first place. The decay of hard tissue, like bones, takes a really long time, which is why bones are almost always the part of the organism that gets fossilized. But this means that softer tissues, like skin or muscle or guts or, any other kind of fleshy tissue, all of this stuff gets eaten away by scavengers, or it rots away within weeks of death. Fossils take thousands, if not millions of years to form, so soft tissue that decays in a month just isn't going to get fossilized. Third, the older a fossil is, the more likely it is to have been destroyed by an earthquake, or a volcano, or eroded away in a flood, or by rainstorms, or broken apart by the roots of some plant, or the claws of, a dinosaur, or whatever. For this reason, fossils are biased towards more recent species who've had time enough after their extinction to become fossilized, but not so long that even the fossils have worn away into the dust. And perhaps most obviously, species with huge populations of many thousands or millions of individuals are, simply by rolling the dice more often, going to have more fossil samples than a species with a smaller population. All of these things need to be taken into consideration when you're using the fossil record to reconstruct phylogenetic relationships. Fossils can and have been used to recreate the evolutionary history of life on Earth, which will be the subject of the next series after this one. Alright, so I've been talking for a while now about the genetic relationships that go into constructing phylogenies, and I talked a little bit about how fossils are used to create phylogenies in the absence of DNA to study. You should understand, at the very least, that phylogenetics is the study of lineages and genetic relationships between species. If you listened to the last episode, you should be familiar with how species diverge and speciate. I'm going to fuse these two concepts now, and discuss how a common ancestor can diverge and speciate to produce a nice monophyletic family. When a common ancestor begins to rapidly diverge and create a wide group of descendant species, this is called an adaptive radiation. The population literally radiates outward, moving across space, across the landscape, finding new habitats and new niches, and they adapt to fit into their new home. As all of these sibling species split up and adapt to their own specific habitats, they diverge from one another and eventually speciate more and more. We can see adaptive radiations in real time, in real life, and we can also see them in the fossil record. When one strata contains the fossils of a single species, and the next strata contains many fossilized skeletons all similar to the first, but with various differences, it can be reasoned that the ancestor species underwent adaptive radiation, and from an evolutionary perspective, they rapidly created a large and varied group of daughter species. In a previous episode in this series, I was trying to make an example of disruptive selection in action, and I used a population of lizards who lived in the trees. These lizards were a single species at first, but different selection pressures were at work for the lizards who tended to hang out in different parts of the tree. This disruptive selection split the population into two groups of lizards, into two subpopulations, those with brown camouflage, who dwelled on the ground and roots of the tree, and those with green camouflage, who reside in the leaves of the tree canopy. This could be seen as a kind of adaptive radiation in progress, where the ancestor species geographically split up and adapted to their new habitats. Let's say that the treetop-dwelling lizards are now experiencing a new selection pressure regarding the available food. They eat the insects that crawl on the leaves of the trees. Some of these insects are small and tasty, but nutritionally weak. And some of these insects are bitter and poisonous, but they're large and full of nutrients. So those treetop lizards with weak stomachs who can't handle the poisonous insects will almost exclusively feed on the smaller, more mild insects. Other treetop lizards can handle the poisons, and they receive a fitness benefit through the higher nutritional value per insect eaten. In time, these populations can diverge and speciate to fully utilize independent food sources. This would be beneficial for both types of treetop lizard, as they're no longer competing with one another for food. Now let's go to the ground, with the mottled brown lizards. They too are experiencing a new selection pressure in their new habitat. Some individuals prefer to stay on the tree itself, where they're familiar with the texture of the bark and the various bugs that come by. But other individuals want to explore and spread out, and they leave the roots of the tree to fan out across the forest floor. If some individuals get far enough away, they can establish a new population, and through the founder effect and allopatric isolation, they can speciate. If the adventurous lizards don't move too far away from the tree, but instead tend to mate with only those lizards who are also adventurous enough to get off the roots and explore a bit, or if they find some new food source away from the tree, then the ground lizards can undergo sympatric speciation. They live in the same area, but by the nature of adapting to their niches, they stop interacting with each other and they stop interbreeding. Okay, so where am I going with all of this? Both the treetop lizards and the ground lizards have diverged again. Our initial population of ancestor lizards has gone through 2 successive rounds of speciation to rapidly produce 4 daughter species. If this wasn't an adaptive radiation before, it's sure looking like one now. So let's continue the trend. The poison bug-eating treetop lizards speciate again, as some populations have adapted to chemical resistance and can now eat even more poisonous insects. The mild insect-eating treetop lizards also speciated again, as some adapted sticky pads on their toes to cling to stems and branches as they eat the bugs off of the undersides of leaves, while the others find their food on the tops of branches or on the rugged bark of the tree trunks. Those lizards on the ground speciate again as well, as they find some other food source, or they spread out to some other area, or because one group evolved some novel trait or adaptation. This is definitely an adaptive radiation, because the original ancestor species has produced descendants who radiated outwards and filled a bunch of available niches in a short period of time. That's the key to this. They expanded to fill niches in the ecosystem, which implies that a niche was left open for them to fill. This is called an ecological opportunity. When a new resource or new regions become available, this presents a new niche. Say we have a forest, and a new kind of berry evolves on a short, bushy plant. This introduces a new niche, because the berry is like a new resource being introduced into the ecosystem. The berries can be used by a variety of animals in a variety of ways. Herbivores can eat the berries for nutrients and energy. Insects can use the berries as a place to lay their eggs. A mold or a fungus can parasitically feed off of the berry's tissue. The point is that once the berries are developed, they're available for other organisms to interact with. And this interaction can develop into a co-evolutionary relationship, like the one that exists between flowering plants and pollinating insects. The flowering plants have literally evolved to depend on the pollinating insects to reproduce. The bugs are attracted to the flowers, and when they land on the petals and romp around, pollen sticks to their bodies. As the bugs move from flower to flower, the pollen gets spread across a larger number of individual plants, each of which can be fertilized by the pollen. This is why the collapse of bee populations is so worrisome. Bees are an extremely important pollinator, and if they were to go extinct, so would the plants that depend on them to reproduce. And that would be disastrous, not just for ecosystems, but for us as well. So, I know my lizard example was kind of up in the air and maybe a little too abstract to really be of any help understanding this. So let me reference a real-world example of a lizard species undergoing adaptive radiation. Across several islands in the Caribbean exist 150 species of anolis lizard. These species are wildly diverse, having adapted to a wide range of habitats on all the islands. The lizards who live in the trees and spend their days running across branches all have short legs and tails, able to efficiently propel them along the narrow woody corridors of the upper tree. Those lizards who dwell on the tree trunks, however, live their lives on a much broader surface. In order to keep their balance and move across the broad surface of the tree trunk, they have longer legs and longer fingers and claws. The anolis lizard species thrive in a variety of other habitats, including the rugged and root-twisted forest floor, the beaches, in swamps and lagoons, by rivers and lakes, you name it. These little lizards first came to the island as a single ancestral population that lived in the underbrush. When the ancestral population arrived on the islands, they found the ecosystems full of plants, but sparse on animals. This lack of competition provided the ecological opportunity for the anolis lizards to radiate out and fill as many available niches as possible. Ecological opportunities are external, as they involve changes or options made available in the outside environment. When the species itself undergoes an internal change, like an adaptation that provides some kind of advantage or new ability, it experiences a morphological opportunity. Morphological opportunities are basically evolved traits that allow the species to access a new food source, or migrate to a new area, or do something that gives them the chance to spread out into a new niche and diversify. If you think about it, there are numerous examples of this that we see every day. Wings, for example, are an adaptation that allows flight. Being able to fly is like a total revolution in movement. Landlocked creatures can only move in a two-dimensional plane, left or right, front or back. They can climb up stuff, but then again, this is really just going forward up an inclined surface. Landlocked creatures are also impeded by obstacles on the ground, like rivers or really steep mountains or cliffs or canyons, or what have you. But when you can fly, you have an entirely new directional axis. You can move in 3 dimensions, which means you can access regions you could never access before. The sky itself is a new habitat full of food, like bugs and fish and smaller birds that can all become food with a quick dive and grab. The evolution of wings propelled the protobirds into a whole new environment, and they radiated throughout this environment and diversified into the huge number of bird species we see today. Mammals have several adaptations that give them morphological opportunities to radiate and speciate as well. The development of fur, for example, allowed mammals to endure colder temperatures than their reptilian and amphibian cousins. Mammals could migrate and populate areas at higher latitudes, where the air was colder and drier. A clade called the amniotes gave birth to young who developed for a time within an amniotic sac, a nutrient-rich solution ideal for fetal development. This birthing mechanism allowed amniote populations, which included mammals, to migrate further away from water than most other animals alive at the time would really dare to risk. If you get too far away from water, your young, their egg sacs might dry out, or you might risk dehydration. And if you're a creature that requires a humid environment and a lot of water, that can be a really serious threat for you. It can really limit the habitats that you can live in. The amniote sac allowed mammals to settle drier regions, in deeper continental regions and higher altitude areas like plateaus, steppes, and mountains. Flowers are another example of an adaptation that offered a morphological opportunity. Flowers are a particularly excellent means of attracting pollinators, which is itself a particularly great way for plants to reproduce, which is why the angiosperms, or the flowering plants, are the most reproductively successful groups of plants in the modern era. I'll cover the Cambrian explosion in more detail in the next series on the evolutionary history of life on Earth, but I should say now that the Cambrian explosion is probably the largest and most prolific case of adaptive radiation ever. The sheer number of new species that emerged in such a brief window of time is almost unbelievable. But that's what happens when multicellular life equipped with mitochondria explodes into an empty habitat. This period saw the evolution of predation, which led to the first complex food webs, which then led to the establishment of the first complex ecosystems, and with that came ecological opportunities for new niches and new habitats. Also, in the next series, I'll discuss extinctions, which are like the dark side of adaptive radiations. Where adaptive radiation creates genetic diversity and new species, extinctions erase species and terminate lineages. When a species goes extinct, the niche they filled in the ecosystem opens up, providing an opportunity for some other organism to step in and fill it. So say we have a habitat full of a certain kind of predator and the prey that they eat. For some reason or another, the predators go extinct. Now the prey populations can reproduce without fear of predation. Their populations swell. But because the original predators went extinct, they aren't competing for the prey anymore. Another predator species can come in and fill the niche by feeding on the swollen prey populations. This is an ecological opportunity being taken. When a huge number of species go extinct in a short time, like they do in a mass extinction, then entire ecosystems can be disrupted or destroyed. Food webs can collapse, and there can be chain reactions of starvation as prey populations die, followed by their predators, and their predators, all the way up the food chain. In cases like these, the surviving species can take tens of millions of years to fully recover the complex ecosystems and food webs that existed before the mass extinction event. During this prolonged period of recovery, the few surviving species have ample opportunities to radiate and diversify to fill all the empty niches left available. Through these mechanisms, ancestor populations diverge and speciate again and again, and as this process repeats and repeats and repeats through evolutionary time, It creates the genetic families and subfamilies that we can study and examine through phylogenetics. I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I hope you learned something cool about how biologists try to organize and categorize living things. Stick around for the next and final episode in this series on evolution, where I'll go into great detail on the exciting evolutionary story of the human species. Thanks for listening.
Would you like to support the BioLogic podcast? It's super easy. When you open a new episode, press the like button or share it with your friends. If you aren't subscribed, you should hit the subscribe button so you can enjoy a new episode every week. You can also peruse our official store, which has a ton of cool stuff like hand-designed t-shirts, hoodies, and stickers. All the links you need are in the description section below.